One of the most common requests I receive is, can you compare Liberal and Labor's major policy areas for me? Yes, I can. This is what this entire video will be. It will be an outline of Labor and Liberal governments in each major policy area. These will be available at Friendly Jordies, the facts. Here they are. Disasters. Liberals' record. During the bushfires, Scott Morrison went on a holiday and lied about going on that holiday. Labor's record. During the bushfires, Anthony Albanese was out volunteering to help SES and firefighters on the front line and used his own money to buy them supplies. Speaking of money, the Liberals realising that they had a massive PR problem on their hands, what with the Prime Minister abandoning the country in the middle of its biggest crisis since World War II, the Liberals spent your taxpayer money on ads to pretend that they had everything under control, despite dozens of chief emergency service officers coming out and claiming that they had been begging the government to come up with contingency plans for such catastrophic summers for years. They were completely and utterly ignored. In contrast, Labor's Bill Shorten actually listened to these dozens of chief emergency service officers and had plans to order our own fleet of firefighting planes almost a year before the bushfires hit. COVID. The Liberals had one of the worst responses to the COVID pandemic in the developed world. For example, while South Korea had an oversupply of testing kits and state-of-the-art tracking devices organised within a week of the first report from China, the Liberal Party had months to prepare, yet as one UNSW expert claimed, they diligently did not do anything useful. Aged care is the federal government's responsibility, and therefore the Federal Liberal Party is responsible for 75% of all COVID deaths in Australia so far. Meanwhile, Labor was asking for JobKeeper and JobSeeker to be adopted a month before the Liberal Party passed it. The Liberals were so incompetent they had to get a former Labor minister to design the scheme. They then used JobKeeper as a mechanism to funnel tens of billions of taxpayer dollars into the hands of extremely wealthy corporations that donate to them, who weren't struggling financially. In fact, some were seeing the best financial years they've ever seen. Scott Morrison was so incompetent it took Kevin Rudd to call the CEO of Pfizer and secure the supply needed for the Australian population. Floods. When Kevin Rudd was in office, he immediately called on the military to act in the Victorian fires and the Queensland floods. Kevin Rudd himself helped students in his electorate evacuate a flooded building, carrying their luggage on his head, and suffered lacerations as a result. During the 2022 floods, let alone not deploying the military on time, Scott Morrison announced an area that was hit by the floods, which was larger than that which was affected by Hurricane Katrina, as a disaster zone 9 days after it became a disaster zone. He then arrived to the flood-damaged areas over 2 weeks later and had large police escorts separating him from the people who had lost their homes, speaking only to the press. He also pork-barreled flood relief and was criticised by multiple senior Liberal MPs for doing so. Corruption. Under Labor, Australia was the 7th least corrupt country on earth. That is up there with Scandinavian countries. Under the Liberals, we have plummeted to the 18th least corrupt country on earth. That is down there with South American countries. As such, Labor committed to a federal anti-corruption body in 2018, something the Centre for Public Integrity, a body made up of judicial experts devoted to reducing corruption, agrees is required, and which has repeated sentiments that this is now long overdue. The Liberals' plan, on the other hand, received 333 parliamentary submissions, none of which supported their proposed commission. It was deemed by the Centre for Public Integrity as being worse than doing nothing, and that if it ever became law, it would be, quote, the weakest watchdog in the country. Education. Labor passed Gonski, which was never allowed to go its full 6-year cycle because the Liberals cut its funding, but while under Labor, Gonski was resourcing disadvantaged schools as planned and producing better than expected results, halting the continual slide in education rankings Australia's seen since Howard. Under the current batch of Liberals, we reached a brand new low, 39th out of 41 developed nations in education rankings. We have worse STEM results than Kazakhstan and are only slightly beating Turkey and Romania. Under the Liberals, we have become one of just 7 developed nations that sees more resources pooled into schools that are overly advantaged than those that are disadvantaged. Private school funding has increased by 6 times more than public funding. Private schools, and we're including schools like Ascom and Scots College here, are now funded by the public purse by up to 80%. In short, the Liberals have made us the most privatised education system in the world. Economy. Labor gave us the best managed economy on earth. The Liberals gave us the worst managed economy in the developed world. Under Labor, Australia was the only developed country on earth to avoid a recession during the GFC. Under the Liberals, Australia was in a per capita recession well before COVID. Labor kept us consistently in the top 8 countries in the OECD for GDP growth, and our unemployment rate was ranked 8th or 9th. Under Rudd, Australia had the 6th lowest unemployment rate in the OECD. The Liberals are currently bragging about their supposedly incredibly low unemployment rates. They are currently 17th in the OECD. In the GFC, during the worst period for job losses, Australia still only lost 23,250 jobs. They were then all added back 2 months later. During COVID, the Liberals saw Australia lose over 1 million jobs. Under Labor, by 2013, our wage growth was ranked 4th in the developed world at roughly 3.5%. Under the Liberals, your wage growth has dropped to 21st in the developed world. Inflation. Inflation has been consistently lower under Labor governments than Liberal governments since the 70s. Debt. Despite winning an election on the promise of reducing Labor's debt, Labor had the 4th lowest debt in the OECD at only 27.5% of the GDP. The Liberals now have the 23rd lowest debt in the OECD at 77% of the GDP. That is almost a 3-fold increase. That jump in gross debt during this period is the worst seen across all OECD countries. If you'd like to know why you always associate Labor with debt, look at this incredible graph from Alan Austin which shows the difference in media coverage on the issue of debt. In 2013, using the IAREM, an aggregate measurement of all overall economic management, Australia was the best performing in the world by a significant margin. Housing. During the Labor years, your wages beat the cost of housing. Your wages went up by 41% and housing went up by 31%. Under the Liberals, property prices have gone up by 105%, while your wages have only risen by 18%. Environment. According to, quote, the most credible, scientifically based environmental performance index in the world, that's according to the former Liberal Environment Minister Greg Hunt, Labor were the 3rd best environmental managers on Earth. The Liberals saw us plummet 18 places to 21st. The Liberals have consistently ranked as having the worst climate change policy in the developed world. According to the EPI, we sunk as low as 150th best climate policy on Earth, only beaten by Saudi Arabia. This is in part due to the Liberals shutting down the Climate Commission. They slashed 1/3 of the Environment Department staff. In contrast, Labor set up a Clean Energy Fund. This was the major reason Australia has been consistently trending in the right direction when it comes to renewable energy. The Liberals have repeatedly attempted to kill this fund, but have been blocked by the Senate for nearly a decade. As a consolation prize, however, the Liberals instead cut its funding by around 1/3. This same fund that the Liberals have repeatedly attempted to kill, that they didn't set up, is the one environmental credential the Liberal Party keeps bragging about this election. Human services/welfare. The Liberals have routinely privatised whatever portions of the Australian welfare system they can get away with. The Liberals set up the robo-debt scheme, which not only didn't make the government any money, it cost the government $721 million. It has also killed more than 2,000 people. Labor's Bill Shorten, on the other hand, was the one that raised the alarm on this. He was also the man who set up the NDIS. The Liberals have also repeatedly attempted to privatise sections of the NDIS. Health. Labor under Kevin Rudd introduced a $30 billion overhaul to integrate Australia's hospital system. That was a series of reforms more radical than anything that had been seen in Australia since Medicare was introduced, which again was under a Labor government. In contrast, 900 items have been reduced or removed from the Medicare benefit schedule. The Liberals broke their election promise by scrapping Medicare locals and also closed all Medicare offices on Saturdays. They also reduced the optometry rebate. The poor are now paying up to $90 for what was originally $7 medication. In total, within their first year of coming to government, the Liberals cut well over $15 billion a year from healthcare funding. $2.5 billion has been cut from aged care programs. Yet in contrast, to remind you at the beginning of this list, how much of your money did the Liberal Party hand out to corporations that didn't need JobKeeper during COVID? $40 billion. This is just one rod of a list we comprise that is not even a fraction of what's public. You can find it and more at friendlyjordies The Facts. Oh, and by the way, one more fact before we go. Under the Liberals, you have become $10,000 a year poorer. Your choice, Australia.
Please share and comment below. Comment.